Okay, well, I'm really happy to introduce you, Heinrich Volmink from South Africa, and I met you at this memorable conference organized by a nonprofit organization called Human Energy, which is very much inspired by Teilhard de Chardin and his concept of the Noosphere. So there you were talking about Ubuntu and the Noosphere concept, which you'll be doing today, and so that's where we met. And then we established a relationship. I learned more about you, Heinrich, and I think there's multiple points of um, of contact. So in the first place, you're an MD with a focus on public health medicine. So there's a health connection for us to explore. There's also a brain science uh, connection, which is exciting. We're going into basic scientific research. And also, you've been a member of parliament in South Africa and something called a shadow cabinet, which is an advisory role, in addition to being a scholar of the concept of Ubuntu, for which you wrote a really excellent thesis, a master's thesis that I read. And that was so helpful for me because, of course, we all know that word and think we know what it represents, but you really provided depth for for this concept that we'll be discussing today. So thank you for joining us, and look forward to the talk as and what follows. Hopefully, establishing an ongoing relationship.
Thank you, David, for the kind introduction. And I don't know, it's good evening from Johannesburg. I'm sure it's kind of a range of time zones that I'm speaking to, but it's wonderful to virtually see you all. And I hope this evening or today will be of some interest. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion component, and so I'd like to throw up my presentation in the first part as a stimulus for discussion. And so on that note, I'm just going to launch straight into the presentation. And again, thank you, David, and also Juliet for all of the assistance in getting us to this point. So I'm going to share my screen now and begin the presentation. So my focus tonight is on Ubuntu and the Noosphere, depending on the pronunciation, and exploring insights for collective consciousness and prosociality. And there are three major sort of components to this. One is the unpacking of the concept of Ubuntu, and then we'll be moving on to the Noosphere as kind of chapter 2, and then kind of pulling it all together, and then speaking about prosociality and implications for that very briefly at the end. So I just wanted to begin with the story. And this story takes us back to 1993, more than 30 years ago in South African history. At that time, Nelson Mandela had been released already from prison and was negotiating the formation of a new and democratic South Africa out of the old regime. And it was a very tense time, of course, because there were multiple stakeholders, multiple interests, and there had been predictions in the kind of global media that we would sort of dissolve into a state of civil war if this wasn't managed properly. It was a precarious moment. And throw into this, we had an event that was truly tragic. It involved Chris Hani, who you can see there behind Nelson Mandela, who was a mentee, not just a mentee, but somebody that Nelson Mandela treated as a son. They had a very close bond. He was a leader in the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's party, and was critical in the negotiation process. But on the morning of April 10th, 1993, South Africa kind of woke up to horrible news at about 10:20 a.m. that morning outside of his home in the southern part of Johannesburg, in front of his 15-year-old daughter, Namakwezi. Chris Hani was assassinated by an agent of sort of the right-wing contingent, with the intention of just completely derailing the process. I remember as a young person seeing this on TV and just being stunned, shocked, and angered, as was much of the nation, and riots began to break out across the country. And it is into this, dealing with his own grief in this horrible moment, that Nelson Mandela had this incredible fortitude to get up in front of the nation And he delivered that evening an incredible speech. I'm just going to read a short excerpt of the speech. He said, "The cries of a nation are heard from old men and who bury their sons and daughters whose the cries of a nation are heard from old men who bury their sons and daughters, wives who weep for their husbands, communities who endlessly bury young and old, infants and pregnant women. This killing must stop." Chris Hani championed the cause of peace, trudging to every corner of South Africa, calling for a spirit of tolerance among our people. We are a nation in mourning. Our pain and anger is real. Yet we must not permit ourselves to be provoked by those who seek to deny us the very freedom Chris Hani gave his life for. Let us respond with dignity and in a disciplined fashion. It's difficult for me to properly articulate or share what that did to us as a country. It pulled everybody together. And we indeed did the very thing that he asked for. We responded not out of anger, but out of a determination to honor the life of Chris Hani. And almost a year after this event, in April 27th, 1994, we had our first democratic elections, and Nelson Mandela was elected as president. In fact, next week we have our next election, more than 30 years into 30 years into democracy. So the question is, how did that happen? There are multiple reasons that we didn't disintegrate into civil war at that point. And one of those reasons, I would argue, is that when Nelson Mandela spoke, he spoke to a deeply held belief in the fabric of our country, in Ubuntu, the idea that we are profoundly interconnected. And if any fire started in any part of the country, politically, it would spread across the nation and consume us all. And so I think it was largely Ubuntu that pulled us through that moment. So then what is Ubuntu? Well, Ubuntu is an African philosophy that has many socio-linguistic variations and parallels, not just in Southern Africa, and indeed not just across the continent, but throughout the world, and I'll come to that a bit later. Ubuntu has a deep and rich history in oral literature over a very, very long period of time, but then began to find its way into popular culture with the iconic Drum magazine publishing articles on Ubuntu in the 1950s, proposing it as a worldview, as a profound galvanizing way and perspective coming from our country that could really create rapid change. It then found its way into academic inquiry. I think the first publication was in 1980 on Ubuntu, formal publication. And then in the early 90s, with the transition to democracy, the late Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu began to apply the concepts of Ubuntu at a national level, socially, especially through the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, helping us through a very, very, very sort of tortuous period in our history. So that's the context. And having framed Ubuntu in terms of context, I'd like to now drill down a bit into the concept. So Ubuntu, of course, is a contraction of a number of aphorisms in Nguni languages. So in Zulu, for example, Umuntu, Ungumuntu, Gabantu means a person is person. Umuntu, Ngumuntu, by other people, and Gabantu, by virtue of other people. I am because we are. And so if you were to pull that apart again into its sort of prefix ubu and stem tu, ubu means being or becoming, and ntu means human or person. And we have a great scholar in South Africa, Professor Remose, who speaks about these two parts of the word in terms of philosophical language. He says that ubu, as a generalized understanding of being, may be said to be distinctly ontological, whereas ntu, as a nodal point at which being assumes concrete form or mode of being in the process of continual unfoldment, may be said to be distinctly epistemological. And so you have both identity and sort of process in the word Ubuntu. So a very important concept for many reasons. Again, not just to South Africa, but I think potentially to the world. And so David had alluded to the fact that I studied at the University of Warwick. Well, I did my master's there, sort of in between my medical training and my residency or specialization. And I did as my dissertation a research into the topic of Ubuntu from both a conceptual and a practical sort of viewpoint. And looked at how we could glean lessons for citizenship and governance at a global level. It was a qualitative study, involved fairly in-depth substantive interviews with participants from a range of sectors, including civil service, politics, academia, nonprofit sector. And it sought to answer three main research questions. The first was, what are conceptualizations of Ubuntu? Of course, we have a general understanding, but can we crystallize that into some kind of definitive expression of Ubuntu? The second was, has Ubuntu influenced South Africa? So moving from its concept, has it had any kind of real, realizable impact on the country in different spheres? And then finally, in which ways could then Ubuntu be applied to global governance and citizenship? So the first two questions were at a high level of abstraction, or began from a high level of abstraction, became a bit more concrete, and then the last question was quite concrete and focused on recommendations. So in the dissertation, I defined Ubuntu as a cultural value system which informs both collective and individual identity and action. So it's a very short, contracted sentence here, but it has a lot of sort of content, and especially around sort of identity formation and galvanizing action, and we'll come to that shortly. I have to confess, and I do this happily, that a lot of the thinking around the concept formation came from the great mind of, or the thinking and the work and the writings of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and so that his thought colored a lot of the work that I did, and on the basis of my research, I developed a framework of analysis using Ubuntu to view global governance and citizenship developments, and I'll come to that shortly. So I just want to give you the high level because of time, and we really do want to get into some great discussion. So I'll keep this fairly succinct. So if I split the findings into what the literature showed, and then what I found in terms of my interviews, in terms of a thematic analysis, this is what we found. I found that Ubuntu was understood to be a value system, so it wasn't a specific sort of ethic per se or a individual value, Ubuntu, but it was in fact a value system underpinned by a number of different sort of characteristics, and that this value system was characterized by two main thrusts. One was interconnectedness, the fact that we are profoundly interconnected as people, so human interconnectedness. And the second was a phronetic finding, phronesis, practical wisdom, that there was some action involved in Ubuntu. When I looked at Ubuntu in the South African context, I saw its sort of almost ubiquitous presence, right, throughout many different fields and spheres. So from management and administration and leadership to the political and public sphere to kind of jurisprudence and the legal domains, and for example, its utilization in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission I mentioned earlier. And then finally, that there was a plurality of cultural resonances. So Ubuntu was a particular manifestation in our time, but I found that there were parallels in many different cultures. And this is an important point to come back to again and again. And finally, that there was indeed a value or utility in discussing this within citizenship and governance discourses. With regard to the findings, the thematic analysis, the participants spoke about Ubuntu as being a social construct, a cultural philosophy that had identity and action, again, interconnectedness, identity, action, practical wisdom, and that there was a positive expression of Ubuntu in its truest form, but that it could be contorted or distorted into a negative version. They agreed that there were both historic and contemporary points of value that Ubuntu had for our country, that it enhanced democracy, certainly our march towards democracy, but that its full expression was impeded by factors such as injustice and inequality. And then finally, that on the global stage, Ubuntu could certainly enhance governance and citizenship, but again was challenged by prevailing geopolitical dynamics such as vast economic disparity, inequality in terms of political agency, etc. So then I mentioned earlier that that there was this potential negative manifestation of Ubuntu, And so in my dissertation, I speak about the two faces of Ubuntu. And it's important just to clarify this as a huge disclaimer. It's not saying that Ubuntu has a positive and negative per se, or that it sort of has there's a carbon copy of Ubuntu. But what this is saying is that you have Ubuntu as understood in its truest form. And then when that is distorted by certain factors, it can be expressed negatively. So Ubuntu in its true form, in its normative form, you have ethical decision-making, a sense of connectedness, ethical behavior. But then when Ubuntu is mixed in the form of, as one of the participants said, a deadly cocktail, mixed with particularism or essentialism. So the idea that, we as a small group here are essentially different from all the other groups. We then are in fact exceptional, right? So exceptionalism emerges from essentialism. We are above and superior to. Then you have a horrible manifestation where you have patronage with corruption. You have the idea that if you don't have Ubuntu, you're not one of us, and so therefore you're excluded. You have the difference or the removal of responsibility. We'll excuse all sorts of very vociferous actions because you're one of us. You've got Ubuntu, so we'll overlook all these horrible activities. Again, this is not Ubuntu. It's a distortion, a contortion, a perversion of Ubuntu, but it exists as a risk, and so it's important to note. So moving on quickly to the framework. So coming back again to the normative or the positive understanding of Ubuntu, if you had a scale, so Ubuntu as distorted, we'd see narrow particularism on one scale, but then Ubuntu as properly understood would emerge in terms of identity formation as a broad humanism. I use that term in the sense of an inclusive, optimistic anthropology. I know that's a bit clumsy, but that's the idea of that broad humanism. And as you move up that scale, you have a true reflection of Ubuntu, and that can enhance global citizenship. And then if you look at the decision-making or action domain, when you have narrow interest agreements, so in other words, we will act on our group because only we have Ubuntu and you don't, you have a low expression. But then as you move towards broad consensus building, where we hear all the voices, especially those at the periphery, you then have a true reflection of Ubuntu, and that can enhance global governance. And putting these together, I came up with this matrix, where quadrant 2, of course, was the aspirant quadrant, right? So in quadrant 1, just to give examples, where you have a high focus on citizenship, but a low interest in consensus building, you have these massive demonstrations at international meetings, as an example. When they are peaceful, they reflect Ubuntu. In fact, an injury to one is an injury to all was a very important part, reflective of Ubuntu was a very important part of the passive nonviolent resistance in our past. But when those peaceful demonstrations turn into violence and destruction, tips over from quadrant 2 into quadrant 1. Quadrant 4 is when you have great aspirations to reach some kind of consensus, but you have narrow conceptualizations of a collective identity. And examples, there are failures to reach broad agreements at climate summits. The worst case scenario is quadrant 3, which combines narrow interests with restricted conceptualizations of collective identity. There you have kind of despotic regimes, a North Korean regime or the Burmese junta as examples of that. And then finally, the ideal scenario, which is broad and inclusive humanism combined with an authentic desire for consensus building, which potentiates positive outcomes. You can see examples in the formation of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and then also the graduation to the Sustainable Development Goals, which really pull these two components together quite powerfully in the formulation phase. Of course, the implementation of the different story faces many challenges, but the way that those goals are formed, for me, really reflects quadrant 2 sort of outcome, and reflects Ubuntu. So now for something completely different, we're going to chapter 2, which looks at the noosphere or noosphere. I prefer noosphere, you can use either term, but it's impossible to speak about what the noosphere is. I mean, it's a fairly exotic word, but it's impossible to even get there without first referencing these three great minds. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the great French Jesuit paleontologist, powerful scientific mind, as well as philosopher and theologian, who together with Vladimir Vernadsky, who was a biogeochemist, developed the idea of the noosphere in the 1920s with the work of Edouard Leroy who was a French mathematician, philosopher, and a mutual friend. He kind of pulled these two great minds together. So what is the noosphere? Well, it can be defined quite simply as a sphere of human consciousness and mental activity, especially in regards to its influence on the biosphere and in relation to evolution. The Human Energy Project, where David and I met last year, has a phenomenal understanding of this concept, and they speak about it as being the sphere of thought enveloping the earth, coming from the Greek word nous, and this is why I prefer noosphere, but you could use noosphere, and spharia, which is sphere. And it's the idea that the third stage of human development is that of the noosphere. The first phase being the geosphere, the rocks, water, and air, and then the biosphere, all living things, and then eventually now the emergence of this global mind or noosphere. You can arrive at the third story in two different ways, as Human Energy so brilliantly articulates. You can arrive at it from a kind of natural science perspective. So the first story would again be the cosmic sort of evolution, ultimately resulting in this kind of molten rock that hardened in all these inorganic substances that we call Earth. The biosphere, then the spread of life, the phenomenon of evolution, the spread of life over the planet's surface, and the noosphere now, the enveloping new level that's just as real as those other spheres on Earth. And then the second approach to the third story would be through our socio-cultural history. First being, in our antecedents, our ancestors, the understanding of the universe through myth and through belief systems, trying to understand what was in, and still is very much unknowable, in the form of different religious and philosophical thought. The second story then would be in the 16th and 17th century, the explosion of the scientific revolution and a sort of rational thought and logical deduction, which predominated for a long time. And then the third story being the pulling together of the sacred and the scientific in this great expression, again, of the noosphere. And so those are the ways that you can arrive at the third story. So moving on then rapidly to unpacking the concept of the noosphere. Because like Ubuntu, I'm sure this is a bit novel to some on the call. It was certainly to me for a long time. Human Energy pulls the threads of these 8 sort of components into a focal point on the noosphere. They speak about heredity, tools, consciousness or self-consciousness, communication, population, trade, cerebralization, convergence. That's a lot of sort of words there thrown in, and I'm going to unpack each now in turn. But what's important to state also is that what the Human Energy group did is that they then pull these threads through the 4 great eras of human history. The Paleolithic era, the Neolithic era, the Classical era, and of course now a modern era. And so we'll be looking at these 4 phases and how these 8 components created conditions for neospheric emergence. So let's begin. So heredity then is the passing down of knowledge, not just genetic, but also social information from generation to generation. In the Paleolithic era, we saw this in the emergence of stories and narratives, sitting around the campfires, speaking about the encounter with a predator in those early days was phenomenal. No other animal species could do that. And in doing so, we could pass and encode down important information that resulted in the survival of our species. In the Neolithic era, we saw the passing down of cultural heredity, for example, in the understanding of agricultural cycles of nature and how that impacted on our development and our growth, and understand and sort of beginning to engage with the crop development in meaningful ways. And then in the Classical era, we begin to see the transmission of memory in the form of a hyperbody. So, when our ancestors encountered a danger and protected their families, that parental instinct was in fact a manifestation of a group, a synthesis of a group knowledge that was passed on through generations of how to protect, how to evade danger, how to keep our loved ones safe. And those individuals acting to protect their loved ones are in fact then individualizations of a hyperbody, which is a very interesting concept in and of itself. And in the modern era, we see cultural synergies passing down from generation to generation, merging in this global mind in very unique ways. So that's heredity. The next thread is tools. So the next way of weaving this together is to look at how tools begins to enrich the conditions for neospheric emergence. So by tools, we speak about the entire spectrum of human invention, allowing for evolution without necessary biological changes. So we kind of outsourced our adaptation to environment through these tools and remained fairly stable as a species. In the Paleolithic era, hundreds of 300,000 years ago, on forwards, we see the early harnessing of fire as a powerful tool for many reasons. Cooking of food, for example, that allowed rich nutrients to then reach our systems and gave us an advantage, and many other values. So that was the first major step forward in terms of tools. And then in the Neolithic era, we see our ancestors beginning to understand time and using great structures like Stonehenge and other structures across the world to begin to, including, of course, in our continent in the north, to begin to track time and understand our progress sort of in a temporal fashion. And the classical era, we see the massive construction of large-scale complex buildings and early civilizations. And then in the modern era, often overlooked a tool. One of the most important developments was that of, or technologies, was that of paper, and readily available paper at that. And this is important to pause at, I think, because we can overlook this. So, before the stage, of course, you had different ways of recording thought, but with readily available paper and quick dissemination, you could have a capturing of the effervescent creativity that could be lost, and ingenuity, moments of insight that could be recorded and then disseminated. And this was so critical in our development. And so tools, the second thread. Then we have this great theme of self-consciousness, which is self-reflective consciousness, allowing individuals and communities to recognize commonalities and evolve collectively. In the Paleolithic era, we had a separation of our species from others, in that there was a continuation of neotenic consciousness. So just to pause on this point, and Human Energy does a great job in describing this. By neotenic consciousness, we speak about in many animals that phase in early childhood where there's so-called kindness and inclusiveness, willingness to engage with other species. But then in adulthood, as many sort of animals move towards adulthood, that's replaced with a strong survival instinct, and the neotenic phase just dissipates. For us as humans, this hasn't been the case. Neotenic consciousness began to become sort of have permanence throughout the life course, so that you had a playfulness, a curiosity, and an openness and inclusivity that continued right into adulthood, even to old age. And one would argue that remained latent in many of our ancestors, but it was there as a potential. And it was very important in terms of self-consciousness. Then you had the emergence of symbolic imagination, the early cave paintings in the Neolithic. And then you had, in the classical era, the massive breakthrough by Zarathustra, the Zoroastrianism sort of founder. And of course, Zoroastrianism itself was arguably the progenitor of the great monotheistic belief systems. But Zarathustra in 2000 BCE began to have these profound thoughts and captured in writing around self-awareness, but not the gods being out there, but us being part of a sacred cosmic unfolding, which is so profound that, and self-reflection was vital to that, was a massive breakthrough in self-consciousness. And in the modern era, we had a really exciting development in terms of time development consciousness of our species. And, if you look at the advances around the cosmic background microwave sort of detection, when you first heard those sounds, the echoes of the Big Bang, with modern scientific breakthrough, it had a profound impact on our consciousness as a species. We began to realize that we were part of the cosmos becoming aware of itself. We heard these early primordial sounds and began to realize that, in fact, we are part of this cosmic evolution. The cosmos wasn't static. We are part of the story of the unfolding of the cosmos, from those early sounds to where we are today. So time development consciousness and cosmogenesis became quite important. Communication is another thread, and this speaks about the exchange of information between individuals through common systems, including symbols and behavior. In the Paleolithic, we had the development of symbolic language, where we could capture thought, abstract thought, in ways that were quite powerful. In the Neolithic era, we saw the construction of rituals And so we moved from symbolic thought that individuals would communicate through cultural rituals that encoded communication of important information across different generations and different cultures. Of course, in the classic era, we had the invention of written language. So, that together with readily available paper really was quite an incredible combination. And then you have the establishment of a global electronic communication system. And this is interesting. If you look at the classical era, the written language would almost be like synaptic points in the emerging kind of neurospheric brain. And then with the modern global electronic communication system, you have the full kind of growth of that nervous system of this human brain, global brain. And then in terms of population, so with regards to population, we then moved to a very important concept that looks at individuals organizing into groups of increasing size and complexity. And so here we look at the Paleolithic era. And so we see then the early spread of human communities across the world, our ancient ancestors spreading from our continent and moving across the world over hundreds of thousands of years, almost like the neural sheets in the embryonic development of this early sort of nascent global brain. In the Neolithic era, we see bonds between individuals unleashing collaboration and creativity. So, early tribes or hunter-gatherers working together to hunt and to forage in new and innovative ways, much more than they could do as individuals. In the classical era, we see critical masses allowing for greater spiritual and philosophical reflection. So we reach a stage in the classical era, where enough of the population, and this is a little bit of a kind of morbid view, but enough of the population were involved in enough of the kind of mundane routine tasks of keeping societies together, that small segments could begin to break away into clusters of scholars and sort of thinkers and sort of religious thought leaders and other great sort of thinkers. And they could begin to self-reflect on humanity and say, well, what is the meaning of this all? These deep existential questions. And ironically, it was out of that group, that small sliver that began to emerge out of humanity, that some of the most profound thoughts came that actually deconstructed the rest of the structure. So ideas around equity and justice, and why do we have masses struggling through life? Surely there's a better way of us living, began to emanate out of this group. And then in the modern era, you have the kind of teleological direction of global population. So what this speaks to is that there's a directionality to where populations have grown now, allowing for the confluence into a global community, to global citizenry. And by teleology, of course, you mean kind of direction, goal direction. So in the same way, an acorn has as its teleological end, an oak tree. The growth of our populations across the globe through all these many eras has this kind of a point, an endpoint for now of the emergence of the noosphere, the global mind. Then we have trade. Trade is a thread that speaks about the circulation of goods and value between and across communities. In the Paleolithic era, you have the early trading networks accelerating development. The Neolithic era, you have that morphing into co-evolutionary circulations of trade, where goods began to then improve and allow different societies to grow in tandem. In the classical era, you had the invention of money, the work in ancient China sort of dynasties, where you had the kind of emergence of sort of coins as sort of containers of the potential power or the potential energy of money, and that then being exchanged using as an intermediate point different important sort of goods. And in the modern era, trade networks that have emerged almost like a global circulatory system. So if communication spoke to the kind of the central nervous system, trade then speaks to the circulatory system, circulating many sort of novel innovations across the globe. The second last thread speaks to cerebralization. Cerebralization is the externalization of human thought into shared collective experience, the codification of expressed sort of, again, collective thought. In the Paleolithic era, we had the discovery and the power of collective intelligence. Again, our early ancestors learning how to work together in units. In the Neolithic era, the application of collective intelligence connecting with heredity to enable us to more intelligently manage plants, domesticate animals. In the classical era, the emergence of mathematical thought, from again the northern parts of a continent through to the Pythagorean thought and application of mathematical principles for human advancement. And in the modern era, the collective intelligence expressed through great technological marvels, like the James Webb telescope, which human energy uses so powerfully. You imagine the James Webb telescope that's gone out now. Who made the James Webb telescope? It wasn't any one individual. It was a noospheric sort of emergence. It was no one person could have created that telescope. It was the coming together of many minds from many different parts of the world that allowed for that. And as a telescope looks out at the cosmos in wonder, it almost forms an eye with the global mind forming a brain that can interpret all of that information in ways that are digestible for the entire human community. And so it's a very important, I think, manifestation of the noosphere. And then finally, convergence, which speaks about the coming together of individuals and communities around a common goal or focus, often with novel outcomes. And the importance there is that it's not just convergence, but novel outcomes that come through those convergences. So we know, of course, that the diversification is important in evolution. We spread, for example, of life with the emergence not just of new sort of genera, but sometimes new phyla, right, as part of evolution. But then we have the convergence into Homo sapiens sapiens, where we had a more or less stable species. And this reflects the coming together, for example, after the Big Bang, the divergence of the Big Bang, the coming together of those elementary particles, the atoms into compounds and molecules that then resulted in the sort of early star formation. Again, that cycle of diversification and convergence in noosphere really is on the arc of convergence. Neolithic era, we saw the discovery and value of synergistic and collaborative intelligence. In the classical era, we saw the emergence of the coalescing of hunter-gatherer societies into those early civilizations. And in the novel era, in the contemporary era, we see a new cosmopolitan emergence, a new kind of global community, a global humanity that has all sorts of novel values and that is profoundly reflective of the noosphere. So that's a whistle-stop tour of those different threads, and we moving towards the last chapter. But before we do, I just want to speak about how Ubuntu then links to this. So if you look at convergence, well, Ubuntu is an expression of convergence. There's natural cooperation in Ubuntu. It's been argued by a colleague in the Ubuntu Global Network, Ricardo Santos, that you see Ubuntu in natural phenomena. Why did a unicellular organism move towards multicellular life? There was a force that was pulling them together, and Ubuntu is kind of a reification of that at a cultural level, but it's a fundamental force. But there's also novelty that needs to come through convergence. And with Ubuntu, for example, I have novel social resilience, a novel way of addressing great challenges, like we did in South Africa when we faced the pressures of the new democracy, and we're able to emerge through those difficult times. Cerebralization, with Ubuntu, we learn lessons from collective intelligence. Ubuntu is, in fact, a form of collective intelligence, but also provides, over and above that, a global ethic, or group ethic. New Politics speaks about the politics of the noosphere. And so Ubuntu is a compassionate global ethic that can emerge. With trade, we see Ubuntu speaking about shared benefit being central to trade. And this is important. So it is the opposite to extractive capitalism, in the sense that that it's not about what one group can benefit in the expense of the other, but it's about shared benefit being essential in transactions, economic transactions. And then then we have that sort of trade driving innovation towards collective upliftment being important in Ubuntu. Deep empathy is a way in which population and Ubuntu come together. These two important chords. Empathy is the core of Ubuntu. I mean, this is really what it's about. It's about seeing yourself in the other. And also, it's an expression of a universal value. As I studied Ubuntu, what I began to realize is that Ubuntu is one manifestation, but there were expressions like Ubuntu in different parts of the world. In Latin America, there's Sampatia. In the Mediterranean, there's Philatimo. In the East, there's Confucianism with Zen, virtue of compassion. All of these And what I began to realize is that all of these expressions were speaking to the same thing. So Ubuntu is kind of one branch of the common trunk of a deeply felt and innate interconnectedness that we've seen throughout cultures throughout history. In communication, Ubuntu is a language, a unifying force. If I reflect on the words of Archbishop Tutu, he speaks about, quote, a person with Ubuntu being open and available to others, affirming of others, not being threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished when others are tortured or oppressed or treated as if they were less than who they are. And so that kind of quote, unquote, those are kind of the language expressions or the powerful oratory that comes through kind of the Ubuntu framework. And that this language often is compassionate and restorative as a form of dialogue is important. And then we move to the idea of the expanded self. So when it comes to self-consciousness, what Ubuntu does, it says that there's a personhood that each of us has that has two components, the individual component. So Cartesian thought would say that's all there is, right? I think, therefore I am. I am the individual. That's my personhood is the individual. With Ubuntu, it says that as a person, as Heinrich, as David, as Juliet, and others here, we have two components. We have the individual component, our identity as individuals, but our personhood expands to encompass our collective component. This group on this call, the larger communities from which we form, are part of our personhood as much as our individual, and we hold these two in a dynamic tension. Ukama is another term related to Ubuntu, whereas Ubuntu speaks about kind of human solidarity. Ukama is a Shona concept that speaks about a cosmic solidarity. So this is Ubuntu with the cosmos. It's Ubuntu with all things. It's ecological solidarity. It's also Ubuntu in terms of consciousness across time with our ancestors and with our descendants. Tool speaks about obviously technology, and here Ubuntu drives tools towards common good outcomes and also sets a qualitative direction of technological development. So with the Ubuntu thought, we ask the right questions in terms of innovations. Why do we need to develop this? We need to develop it for the common human good, as opposed to developing it for particular groups' gain or advantage over other groups. And so, harnessing, for example, artificial intelligence for the common good and in infusing it with that solidarity is important in Ubuntu. And then finally, in heredity, we see Ubuntu manifest in many ways. In the cultures across this continent, we have a very strong affinity to the voice of the elders. There's this term that we use here. It says the youth can walk faster, but the elders know the road, right? So having that transmission of wisdom is important. And then also our intergenerational commitment to future Noospheric leaders, to emergent leaders in this global mind, is also part of how Ubuntu influences heredity. So in the last 10 minutes of my presentation, I'd like to kind of go where kind of, from my perspective, angels fear to tread, because most people in this call know these ideas far better than I. But what I'd like to do is reflect on the closing thoughts on the pro-social sort of behaviors and pro-social thought and application, and how Ubuntu may be of value, again, through the lens of sort of the Noosphere collective in consciousness to this domain. So moving to pro-sociality, again, to step back, Ubuntu is a value system based on empathy and compassion, underpinned by phronesis or practical wisdom. And through the idea of this multi-level selection lens, it may be argued that Ubuntu could come with in-group costs, right? But could provide substantive between-group benefits, provided that risk of essentialism, that the two faces, the negative face doesn't emerge. So an example of what that sentence means could be seen in South Africa. In our transition to democracy, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had a lot of good, but perhaps had within-group costs in that individual cases where it strongly felt that we needed retributive justice, were kind of overshadowed by pardoning and restoration. So you had individual cases where people maybe felt that they didn't get the justice they needed because the perpetrators that acted on behalf of the apartheid regime were pardoned, simply pardoned. But the larger between group costs, rather between group benefits of that approach was that we had a transition to a peaceful democratic state. And so it had a great between group benefit, even though it may have had those, or did in instances have that within group costs. So now I'd like to move to the profound work around the sort of core design principles that David has worked on, incredible work of Liz Ostrom. I mean, it is just foundational work, and working together with his colleagues, Wilson and Hayes. I'd like to look at those 8 principles very, very quickly and speak about how Ubuntu may color them. So the first core design principle in pro-social thought, of course, is shared identity and purpose within a group. And here Ubuntu is a natural fit, right? The idea of the individual and collective personhood that are described and the identity dimension of Ubuntu speaks to that quite powerfully. But it's important that this needs to be combined with principle 8, which I'll speak about in a moment, and Ubuntu's sort of flavoring of that to avoid the two faces risk. In core design principle 2, it speaks about equitable distribution of contributions and benefits. Here, the action dimension of Ubuntu, the duty that comes from me being part of a whole, of being interconnected, is very important. The words of Archbishop Tutu then still kind of echo. I act in community, and as I benefit, others benefit. As they benefit, I benefit. Is important, but it needs to be balanced by those community benefits, not subsuming individual benefits. In core design principle 3, we speak about fair and inclusive decision making. That speaks to the decision-making axis of that Ubuntu framework that I spoke about earlier, where it is naturally around consensus building. But it's important in that consensus building, in the italics, there is that we curtail the danger of muting outlying voices as we seek consensus. The italics, I should mention, are potential sort of threats to the application of Ubuntu to pro-sociality that need to be mitigated. And this kind of normal writing is how it could directly benefit pro-sociality. Core design principle 4 speaks about monitoring agreed behaviors. Well, there's natural self-regulation due to the identity dimension of Ubuntu. If I feel that I am in fact profoundly interconnected to those around me, my behavior is going to be shaped by that. If I act in a way that harms others, I'm in fact harming myself. It's kind of self-destructive to act in those ways. But it's important that in establishing those Ubuntu norms, we don't stifle free thought and agency. Again, that risk of that adverse expression of Ubuntu, where we kind of exclude people if they don't not seem to have Ubuntu. It's important to mitigate against. Core design principle 5 is the kind of graduated responding to helpful and unhelpful behaviors, so punishment and reward. There's a shared value system in Ubuntu that creates a natural reference point for behavior that tends towards the helpful. But again, it's important that in seeking the kind of Ubuntu principle of kind of consensus and restoration, we don't impede corrective actions. We don't kind of overlook destructive behavior because we want to maintain harmony in the group. That's important to guard against. In core design principle 6, we speak about fast and fair conflict resolution. The restorative justice element of Ubuntu is really, really critical in this for many reasons that I think are self-evident. But again, restoration must result from just outcomes. Kind of speaks to the risk of principle 5, in that as we seek kind of restorative outcomes in conflict, that we ensure that there is also justice for the individual that isn't overlooked. Core design principle 7 speaks to authority to self-govern. Well, self-determination was critical in the way that Ubuntu influenced the movement against apartheid in South Africa. It was essential, and so this again is natural to Ubuntu. But in seeking that self-determination, it's important that there's an avoidance of us versus them. Again, the idea of essentialism. We have Ubuntu, they don't, can then begin to disassemble this whole principle. And so it's important to understand that Ubuntu, in its normative understanding, says that there is no us and them. There's only us, right? We are a common humanity, and to hold to that principle. And then finally, in the core design principle 8, we speak about collaborative relations with other groups, so that you have the groups forming kind of Lego blocks, and they begin to kind of assemble with other groups to form this emergent sort of meta level of sort of global pro-social community. The identity formation axis of the Ubuntu framework speaks to this quite powerfully. But again, we need to buffer against essentialism, that as we build these Lego blocks, that we don't have certain blocks thinking they are exceptional and pulling down the whole structure, but that there's an understanding that all blocks are equal, all groups are equal as we build a bigger framework that looks very much like the Noosphere. And I just want to hover on this before I conclude. Core design principle 8 is crucial in the intersection of all these three great thoughts: pro-social thought, Ubuntu thought, and Noospheric thought. It's kind of a meta principle that pulls all this together as we pull all these blocks and create this global emergent mind. And so here we find many points of rich intersection that we can explore maybe further in the discussion. So to conclude with this final thought, and that is that much like we saw in South Africa, we are on a global scale at a crisis point, a mercurial point, a precarious point, and we need the emergence of a compassionate noosphere in order for us to navigate through this. And that's where Ubuntu is important. It creates a space for the development of that compassion. A great colleague, Marta Lenotowicz, who's also part of the Human Energy Group, and she's based in Belgium. At the conference that David spoke to again earlier, we had a conversation, and what Marta was saying is that as a thought experiment, imagine we had Vernadsky and we had Pierre Teilhard de Chardin in those early discussions in the 20s, and we added to that conversation Archbishop Desmond Tutu. We maybe not have spoken so much about the mind, the noospheric, the cerebral sort of element. We may have spoken about the mind and heart of the human community. So the injection of compassion probably would have come through Archbishop's engagement in that particular sort of hypothetical scenario. So compassionate noosphere is what emerges with Ubuntu. And with Ubuntu, then we have this great opportunity where you have the anchoring of sort of personal identity in the individual, but the expansion of that to the community and to the globe and to the cosmic sort of solidarity of the karma, which then creates within each of us an expanded consciousness, which is, I think, quite powerful and valuable. And through all of this, I would argue that we can reawaken a sense of interconnectedness and foster deep compassion and empathy that steers collective consciousness into profoundly pro-social directions. And that is my last slide. Thank you very much.
Okay. Wow. Well, first of all, that was very powerful and eloquent, Heinrich. I'm so very glad at all aspects of that. And so we have an opportunity, I think, half an hour now. If people have to leave, of course they should. And thank you for staying to this point. But I think we have a good half hour to discuss the rich implications of this. And please raise your virtual hands if you know how to do that. Otherwise, raise your real hands, and we'll have a round of discussion. I typically don't like to go first, and so I would invite others to step forward. And please don't be shy about sharing your views or your questions. And then I'll come in a little bit. But please, who's going to be the brave first person? Chip.
I could ask you to go in two different directions. I'll try to blend them. As a peace builder and political scientist who's written about South Africa, Ubuntu is important to the work that I do in the book I'm writing. It's going to play a significant role, I think. And in my own life, there were two occasions when it really impacted me directly. In the late 90s, I was on a panel in London with a guy named Tains Eloff, who you may know of, who was a white pastor who was a very early convener of people across racial and political lines. And I don't remember if he used the word Ubuntu or not, but he lived it. 20 years later, 2018, my organization and others brought a group to Washington for a few days that include Rolf Meyer and Ibrahim Rasool, who I assume you knew because you probably opposed him in the Western Cape. And as the two of them talked, again, it was a decade ago, so I don't remember if they used the term Ubuntu or not, but they lived it. But certainly Rolf, just given the role that he played in the transition. And so what grabbed me in those two events and many others is that this is a really powerful concept. And then that leads really to the question, which I don't have an answer to, but I would love to have this group help get there. And that is, how do you take ideas like the Noosphere or Ubuntu or any of the other things that the Archbishop and others raised at the TRC and move those into popular culture, not just theoretically, but how do we get people like my sister or my son-in-law or my neighbor to see what one of that, in the case of my work, one of the groups I work with, the National Federation for Community Mediation, literally has as one of its taglines, "I am because we are, and we are because I am." And so how, given your experience in South Africa, especially now being in the opposition to a government that has not done a great job of living up to Ubuntu, how in your experience, how do you take these ideas and make them part of popular culture?
Chip, what a great question. And I'd like to begin by thanking you for sharing so powerfully your experiences and the work you've done for our country, in our country. It's deeply appreciated. Thank you. I'll begin with just one kind of disclaimer, is that I am blissfully apolitical. And now I've come out of the political arena. I've got post-political stress disorder, I think, and feel quite strongly that there are strengths and weaknesses in all parties. So I don't have any political affiliation at all now. But I think it's an important question. There's two ways to tackle this, and I don't want to. I think there are other thoughts that really need to come through and could do it much better than I. But the first is to not romanticize Ubuntu, because then it becomes so abstract. It's just unattainable. So Ubuntu means we all live together in harmony. Wow, it's like utopia. So we're never going to get there. It's just a great thought. But to see it as a real, growing, dynamic sort of concept, and as we have these discussions, we're adding to Ubuntu. We're adding to Ubuntu. And so I think that's the first, is that we are contributing. So we are part of the Ubuntu sort of unfoldment, if you like, the expansion of Ubuntu. The second is to have this great realization that I had when I did the studies and speaking to people from across the world, is that Ubuntu is, again, a particular manifestation, unique in a sense to our culture, but also universal. There's something like Ubuntu in most cultures I've come across, and I mentioned some of those. And if I use the example from your context, I should mention that I am from South Africa, from Cape Town, but my dad studied at Cornell, so I spent many years in my formative sort of development as a kid in upstate New York, close to where David is now. And so I obviously was exposed to the NBA. And so, if I go back to 2007, 2008, the Boston Celtics, Doc Rivers, right?
Yeah.
Ubuntu, right? You remember the chanting of the crowd, Ubuntu, Ubuntu, because there's resonance. So bringing it into sort of the into the kind of contemporary mind by showing that, in fact, you have Ubuntu, it's residual already there, you just haven't seen it yet, is a very important project to undertake, to try to answer or address the great question that you raised. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. We got a great lineup here. So so happy to have these raised hands. So thank you, Kathleen and Camille, and Mitch, you're next.
Perfect. Well, did you just say post-political stress disorder? I think I'm going to have to add that into my vocabulary because I feel the same being American at the moment. But yes, thank you very much for your presentation, Heinrich. I loved it on so many levels. Um, and so I think I want to begin with a question. So is Ubuntu considered part of the broader indigenous studies literature? Is it considered an indigenous belief system? Because it's somewhat, to me, it gives off all the markers of an indigenous belief system. You know, it has the cosmological aspect, or what you refer to as the ontology, saying how the world is more of a pantheistic viewpoint of everything's interconnected and whatnot. But it also comes with the subsequent ethics attached to it, that there's no dividing line between the ontology and the ethics, which for me is a very big marker of what of an indigenous belief system. So is it considered indigenous in most by most Ubuntu practitioners or scholars?
Great question. Thank you, Mitch. It's a good one. It's a bit difficult to answer as directly as I'd want to, because I would say yes, in terms of its sort of anthropological research. You have it classified as an indigenous sort of belief system originating from sort of Southern Africa and kind of emerging. But again, it's just the previous point that I spoke to about Chip. You have something like Ubuntu in these different belief systems. So again, I mentioned Sampatia in Latin America. So it is indigenous, but it is an expression of something very, very universal that expresses in different ways, in contemporary ways, also very contemporary ways. The other thing to say though that in literature, the Ubuntu, there was a lot of criticism. There has been a lot of criticism in the the kind of bastardization of Ubuntu, if I can use that. I know it's a bit coarse. In the Ubuntu of management consultancy, or the Ubuntu of marketing, or the Ubuntu of so the explosion in that kind of literature and kind of popular literature that isn't really Ubuntu. Is people kind of using the sense of human interconnectedness and then throwing Ubuntu on top of it and saying this is the Ubuntu of kind of leadership 101. Now there is Ubuntu-driven leadership without a doubt. I mean, we see this in Nelson Mandela, but it's very deep, and so that kind of. So we have to be careful of the popularization that doesn't become too superficial. And in some literature, it's kind of been expressed in that way also.
Perfect.
That's
Awesome.
great. Thank you. Camille, I'll yield to you and then to Kathleen. I'll go after the two of you. So Camille, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm talking with policy analysts, and when I ask them, about the impact, how they evaluate the impact of policy and so on, they're convinced they're doing a really great job. But then when you talk to people who are impacted by it, they're just like, no, there's no communication. And so just kind of, yeah, maybe it's this consultancy of Ubuntu types. I don't know. I want to know. First of all, well, I'm completely new to this, by the way, so I forgive the dumb question. I'm interested in literature that would document how it is used in negotiation, in de-escalation, and yes, how do you measure good negotiation from an Ubuntu standpoint?
Thank you, Camille. That's a really great applied question. A question of sort of practice. So I think there are different ways that you could approach this. In policy making, for example, we had this idea in the kind of early democratic state of Batho Pele, which means people first, Batho Pele. And it was a great driver of public policy, especially in kind of the Mbeki era. So what it was saying is that we have to have Ubuntu in the way in which we deliver services, which means that the person delivering services and the person receiving those services, there needs to be some kind of equalization of agency in that. And so, the kind of community participation and collaboration was really critical in that. And so it wasn't about then the state coming in and saying, we've gotten all these resources from Treasury, and now we are going to tell you what you're going to be experiencing when you come to a government institution. But it was rather around what do we need collectively. And so you did kind of see that filter in. But then also, you see in terms of reconciliation processes. Again, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as complex as it was around, how do we see the humanness in each other? And how do we then, looking back at the atrocity, the abhorrent horror that was apartheid, seeing it in that light and seeing it for the kind of alien distortion of our humanity that it was, by taking together people who perpetrated these horrible acts in apartheid and those who were victims of that, and pulling them together in a common humanity. There was this incredible moment where you had one of our leaders, Frank Shikani, this incredible minister and scholar and leader in our country, who was then had this moment with the person who tried to poison him during apartheid. And this person actually, in this reconciliation processes, actually washed his feet. It was incredible, really incredible. And how you could have healing and reconciliation. And that was a profound moment of Ubuntu. It was when the scales fall off your eyes and you see yourself in the other. And that's a human thing. It's not just sort of unique to our context, but Ubuntu pulls that out of people. And so if you can get people to that point, you then have profound opportunities for reconciliation that otherwise may seem impossible. If you were to take those two people in the early 80s and put them in a room together, it would be like there was no ways there could ever be reconciliation. One tried to kill the other. But then in the kind of, in the new dispensation, you had this incredible restorative moment. That was
we're seeing it in Gaza and Ukraine right now. I mean, that's what they say for Gaza, right? They need to find their humanity, and you go, wow, given the heat of the situation, it seems really elusive. And so when you enter the negotiation process, I just wonder, what can give indices of progress.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And maybe just one more thought on that is that antithetical to Ubuntu, normative Ubuntu, is the othering. The us versus them is to say, the other, and that is inconsistent. It is impossible to hold that and a kind of true idea of Ubuntu at the same time. It's like doublethink. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Kathleen, and then I'm going to take my turn, Hal, before you, if you don't mind. But Kathleen, then please speak.
Well, I want to start by thanking you for this really elegant presentation, and I so appreciate the way you've woven together both the core design principles, your own perspective, and the perspective of Ubuntu. In a way that really does make it accessible on so many levels. Chip asked earlier, how is this idea disseminated? Well, it's really helpful when people like yourself provide very succinct narratives that people can grasp, where there's complex ideas are translated into metaphors and framing that can be more immediately applied. I particularly like the way you focused on core design principle number 8 and talked about the need to avoid what you called essentialism, or the two faces. And in the example that you just described of the woman who was directly the target of harm, washed the feet of the perpetrator, in a way that is that action speaks to the ethical position of those who take the risk to humanize, step away from othering the offender, and makes that application of core design principle number 8 possible, because by doing that, by stepping forward and moving through the polarity of essentialism, the other person, the other group can kind of fall more into place in terms of fulfilling the meaning of the design principles 1 through 7, and then be part of the network. So it really is a truly systemic application of the principles on a very sophisticated and, I think, spiritual way. But one that isn't overly grand. in that it's not religion. And that's another thing I really like about your presentation, is you're essentially pulling what have been religious ideas about, the golden rule, or, doing the right thing, or the collective good, and you're framing it in just principles of immediate relationship on the individual and group level. So no questions, just acknowledgement and a thank you.
Can I just respond to that,
Yes,
Kathleen?
of course.
And thank you for that beautiful, eloquent input. I really appreciate it, and the kind words and the insights. What is so amazing, and you're quite right. I mean, if you look at Frank Chicani and the perpetrator, Frank Chicani, he would have gladly washed the feet of the perpetrator, but what actually happened was that the perpetrator washed his feet. And what was so profound about that is that you had this individual who, in just a few years ago, had so dehumanized this Frank Chicani that he was prepared to actually kill him, and now was in great remorse and great humility and deep compassion, washing his feet as an act of, asking for forgiveness. Of course, there was that. Again, it was almost like a Damascus Road moment. Yeah, I like what you say, the spiritual element to it, and both left permanently changed. And so I think Ubuntu, the neurospheric thought, speaks about the extraordinary realm, that sacred realm, that it touches on that in these moments, right? Maybe not always, but in these profound moments. So thank you for highlighting that. It was really powerful.
Yeah. So I want to make two very general comments and keep them brief, knowing that we can continue the conversation. The first comment, I think, the concept of the noosphere gets something right, which is that cooperative human society began at a very small scale and has been expanding ever since. And so that means that universal morality is something that's in the future, but has almost never been in the past. It's always been the case that there were groups competing with other groups. And so what we call the othering and so on, that's not a perversion, that's not a contortion, that's the way it's always been, is that the concept of all the universality, Ubuntu and all of its universal cousins in other cultures, always function to unite a group, but never was extended unconditionally to all groups. All cultures had specific contexts in which prosociality was extended to the other. Be kind to the stranger in very, very specific contextual terms. But for the most part, Ubuntu and all of its cousins did the great miracle of forming a cooperative group that either was battling an environment or other groups. So I think that the narrative that Ubuntu is kind of started out universal, and that when we brought in the othering, that it became a kind of a perversion, I think actually is not. We could build an even better narrative by basing it on the noosphere and acknowledging that all cultures have been othered. And South Africa is a great example, because at the very same time, as you know, that the Dutch were colonizing from the south, the Zulu Empire was invading from the north, and so of course all cultures, this is universal, the world around, all cultures had this scale that they were operating with, in which within yielded to between. So it's a challenge for the future for us to extend Ubuntu and all of its related concepts to the global. That's what's in front of us. But we must squarely face the past and the present. And we must realize that if we're going to actually do this, then all kinds of structure is going to be required, which I think is what the core design principles represent. There's real structure to the core design principles. We have to hold people accountable. We have to oppose them under some. We have to make sure that power is distributed. And so I think that we have a narrative like this that we're all in a position to get behind, I think. and it'll be awesome to do that. So that's a huge, a great big one. And let me have you comment briefly on that, wanting to provide time for Helen. But I got another big one. So if you could just comment briefly on that, and let me get another big one on the table, and then proceed to Helen and
I'm
Mitch.
gonna keep it succinct. I think that is an incisive point. It really is. And again, it speaks to the danger of romanticizing
Yeah.
any of these concepts, right? So you say here's Ubuntu, it's a kind of perfect virtue. Put it in a snow globe, kind of shake it and put it up there, and this is what we all need to reflect. That's not the case, and I think you make some really valid points. But also, it's important in that we all understand that we're participating in this massive unfolding in this project. And we pull the cord of Ubuntu, and we pull the cord of the Noosphere thought, and we pull Prosociality into this great future. We imagine that future together. And then we move into unknown territory, of course.
Yeah.
And I think that is, for me, the great work that you're doing with the pro-social movement, which others are doing. But I feel almost like there's an acceleration to that point. We will tip into a new reality, and I'm so excited to be part of that project. So thank you.
Yeah, I think we're just right on the cusp of creating a narrative which is very powerful as a narrative and fully accountable to the science, to scientific knowledge. And so that's so exciting. So my second big point is that when we look at Ubuntu, I think that there's two dimensions to it. One is like the solidarity dimension, but the other is the interdependent dimension. I am because you are. And I think that one of the great contributions of that concept is against the background of the reductionism and individualism of Western thought. So that if you take like do unto others, for example, that's very individualistic. That's like an instruction to an individual. But I am because you are is really recognizing the kind of the systemic nature of the individual in relation to the groups. And also, I want to use the word technology, social technology, for integration, because something about indigenous societies is they could not afford to be reductionistic. They had to be systemic. And Tyson Yunkaporta, in his book on Australian Aboriginal society, his book Sand Talk, makes this point very, very well. There's something that one contribution that indigenous thought has to make to Western thought is its systemic nature, including reconciliation processes, because in indigenous society, if someone was, a bad actor, you had to kind of integrate them into the society in a way that there was no alternative. There was no other place to go. And so I think that some of the adaptations, you might say, cultural adaptations to create cohesive societies having to do with the recognition of interdependence is something which we don't want that to be overshadowed by just the solidarity part of it. There's like a complex systems part of it, which is also then I think it'd be great to recognize that in addition. So I'd love to have your comments on that and then proceed to Hal and Mitch.
Well, I mean, I think you've captured the thoughts so clearly in the question. I think and you're quite right. How do we buffer against the kind of the blanket solidarity, and how do we understand the dynamic, which is dynamic? It's not a the interdependence, right? How do you pull the voices from the periphery to the center? How do you how do you collapse the margins into the middle? This is very important, and it's a complex process, and we can observe it, in a descriptive way, by studying, different cases, or we can actually kind of, I don't want to use the word engineer, but we can begin to understand and apply the principles, and I think this is where the pro-social principles become really important, the core design principles.
And engineers, let's not make engineer a dirty word. Yeah, we want to engineer it. Yes, we do. And if we object to the term social engineering, then we interrogate that. But this is an intentional process. Make no mistake. And then my great colleague, Guru Madhavan, is a systems engineer, and his book, Wicked Problems, is all about this. So anyhow, didn't mean to insert, but shall we go to Hal and then
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, yeah, Guru Madhavan talks about wicked problems in engineering, talks about it in a very interesting way, very closely tied to social problems. And speaking of virtues such as vagueness, which is a kind of a new concept to say an important principle of complex systems engineering is vagueness. Who knew that? All right. So, but you were mentioning politics and being apolitical. You know, the party system, and particularly the two-party system that tends to be recreated every few decades or 100 years in the United States, is really problematic. And the first past the post system has created a system of game playing that has gotten much worse in the last few decades. On the other hand, if you were to have something like crack open the two-party system by having an instant runoff system and a ranked choice system with multiple parties, and you could have parties that begin as movements, and a movement has at its center an idea, which gives you P1 of the your core principles, right? Automatically, you got a group of people who identify intensely with a certain idea, who think that idea is the solution to the world's problems. So maybe we will have a pro-social party one day, or a and other people may go for pro-education party, pro-health, or pro-peacemaking, maybe a particular style of peacemaking as opposed to the vague wish for peace. There's that, and I just want to say that Ubuntu is closer to the concept I have been bumping up against, which is not so much what's the goddamn being nice to other people. What's
do unto
that?
others, do unto others.
Do unto others, and what's the thing that it was mathematically proven couldn't evolve? What's that? I know it's a stupid thing not to be able to remember.
No problem, Al.
Okay.
Well, altruism is a tagline.
Altruism. Yeah, right. I can't think of the word altruism. Well, anyway, I'm so old that I remember singing around the kumbaya around the campfire Sunday, church camp. We didn't know about Ubuntu, but we knew about kumbaya. Anyway, I'm saying what I see coming out of a group of people, including Boyd and Richardson and Heinrich and the very young guy who you were interviewing recently, who's like a really big up and comer, David.
Oh, Michael Muthakrishna.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, they've I don't know, there's UC Davis and University of Arizona, that's where those two were respectively, I think. So I don't know if that's which one of those may be a particular center of the idea, but it also agrees with Michael Tomasello, the finding of plural self. Ubuntu is like kind of pure expression of the idea of plural self. And there are a group of philosophers who are talking about this now, including Margaret, Stephen Darwell, Margaret Gilbert, and others who've reinforced the empirical discoveries that are being built into I think a great theory of what of the reality in human nature of plural selfhood. Even though it doesn't always, even though sometimes it's defining yourself against other people, you know, that's a
How would you
problem.
mind putting those in the chat? Because I want to look at those.
Yeah.
Let's give Heinrich a chance to respond, and Hal, put that in the chat. So those are important.
Yeah.
And Heinrich, maybe you could respond to that, and then Mitch will have that would be the final conversation.
Great. So I'll respond briefly. Thank you, Hal. Really, really great thoughts there. You know, what sprang to mind when we spoke about sort of politics is just kind of, again, these flashbacks, right? This post-trauma of just being in opposition or being in the political or parliamentary arena, which, although it's a Westminster system, is very much like your system in that it's just really oppositional. It's polarizing, it's just banging heads against each other, and having conversations with colleagues in different parties on the sidelines, agreeing on principle, but then stepping into the arena, and then it's just there was no rich integration of thought. Certainly the benefit of the greater good wasn't that it was just about political self-interest, as it is in many, many different systems. And so, you know, the intersection of Ubuntu, neopolitic, and new evolved understandings of democratization is really an important discussion to have, and maybe one that we can open up as a whole new chapter in a future conversation. But I would say that in those conversations, we will not be able to avoid, and I put this as an argument from my side, the spilling over from national to kind of global polity. Because if you speak about kind of the Noosphere emergence, the global mind, there is this kind of going beyond, our kind of nation state groups into the global arena that has to be part of the conversation that links Ubuntu to political reform, to Noosphere or new political thought. So would love to have that conversation, reflect on my own experiences. I think it's so rich, and we should pursue that. Thank you, Hal.
Yeah. You know, I had a really interesting thought as this was unfolding. We already have our multi-level selection initiative that started out here. It's we have so many initiatives in pro-social world, and multi-level selection is just one of them. And I just thought, man, we could just be really doing something major in terms of expanding this concept into this realm and so on. So, and Mitch is the coordinator for that. So I'm kind of you know how that happens. You know, I mean, we're all thinking hard all the time, but all of a sudden there's just a little bit of a breakthrough that takes place. So it's just whoa, man! It's just like, you know, like a football game where the runner just goes through the gap and then sprints to the end zone or something like that. So I can well imagine some really good things coming from this. So Mitch, why don't you bring us home here with the
Yeah.
final comment?
Certainly. No, thank you. So yeah, I think I just want to start with just a few connections that I've made that might be useful, helpful to you. Also thinking about this from the MLS initiative too, some very pertinent examples that you gave in your presentation that I definitely want to use moving forward in the MLS initiative. But the first one, so I believe I'm saying, is it Ukama? It's the idea of individual selfhood with a cosmic selfhood as well. So to me, this sounds very similar to like a Hinduistic philosophy of selfhood of Atman and Brahman, where the Atman is the individual self and more cosmic self is Brahman. So I just thought that was interesting. Another really interesting thing that you said that I love these examples. You're giving the example of Ubuntu from a multi-level selection perspective, and you're mentioning something that it was bad for certain individuals, but it was good because it moved your society towards a more democratic state structure. And so I thought I love these examples of kind of this traditional or ancient thought really pervading into our modern social context today. So it's very, right now I'm researching something called at Tetsopa. I'm doing a grave injustice, but it's the Scandinavian principle. So it loosely translates to kin or clan precipice. So when Scandinavian nations would go through harsh times, the elders would actually jump off a cliff to their demise, so then they wouldn't steal resources from the youth. But they said this is why the Scandinavian response to COVID was the way that it was, that they really placed an emphasis on herd immunity, because they really were saying, like, you know, the elders, you know, they had their time and we want to save this time for the youth and build this herd immunity. So I found that as a really interesting example as well that you gave with Ubuntu. But if I might end here on just one minor criticism, so kind of piggybacking off of what David said here, I believe we don't want to romanticize our anthropological past, but I also don't want to be too presentist. I don't want us to be too presentist in our conceptions of the history. So I believe there were several slides that I would specifically disagree with. It kind of gives me the feeling that it follows a lot of how cultural anthropology used to think, like that we are very primitive beings and we've kind of continuously evolved to the conditions of the noosphere. But I also agree with David that this is something that we can only really have today. But I think your argument might even be more effective if it comes with the nuance of recognizing what I see the general trend in anthropology today is that our ancestors were extraordinarily more complex than we commonly give them credit for. So I think if you bring in that anthropological element, which I think the best book for that is The Dawn of Everything, that to kind of get you into that literature, then I think that almost makes your argument for Ubuntu almost more effective, I believe. So yeah, if you want to comment on that, or if you want to end there.
So I'll just quickly comment, and I know we've gone into sort of overtime, but I think those are very important points. So, you know, Ukama is quite interesting. So Ukama is, if Ubuntu is humanness, Ukama is relatedness. And there's Professor Leslie Lagrange, who's a good friend, who speaks very powerfully of this. And I'm happy to share some of these articles afterwards with the group. But he speaks about Ukama and ecological solidarity really powerfully, and education. So it's interesting that you use that concept. The Scandinavian concept, by the way, if you can please just write it, I'd love to learn more about that. It sounds absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
And so it'd be super keen. And then I think, yeah, you know, I have to, and again, I cited it on the slides, but I can't, you know, David Swim from the Human Energy Group. He does such an incredible job of unpacking each of those threads through those different epochs. I fear a very imperfect job, but if you know, in the slides there's a reference at the end. Brian Swim, Brian Swim.
Yeah, Brian Swim.
He does a phenomenal job of going through each of those 8 core conditions and unpacking it through those eras in those human energy videos. So, you know, that's the reference for all of that, and it's in the.
Yeah. What's that book? I'm sorry. Would you mind putting it in the chat?
It's actually a video catalog on YouTube.
Yeah, we can provide you this. There's much to say about this, and also it's very interesting tension that on the one hand we're telling this grand narrative which becomes our own cosmology, scientific cosmology, and on the other hand getting that right scientifically and avoiding certain errors in terms of is just a work in progress, and so I think we've had a gorgeous time here. I think probably, and it will continue. And so I think that let's just leave it at that. Thank you, Heinrich. And I think that that's one of the great things here is that we're setting up a framework, an international framework for continuous engagement that's intellectual, that's spiritual, and that's practical. That's what we're doing. And so very happy to have you contribute, Heinrich, and to hopefully to continue with your engagement in ProSocial world is something that I look forward to.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I just had a moment to put the video catalog onto the chat group. onto the chat. And I just want to say, maybe just to conclude by thanking you, David, for the opportunity, thanking everybody on the who stayed on for so long. I think that this is just a point in a longer conversation that I can't wait to have with all of you. And thanks again also to Juliet for all the administration around this. So yeah, from South Africa, much gratitude to you all.
Okay, everyone. Thank you.